Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. This week, I'm talking to yet another brilliant debut Aussie novelist. Her novel, The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village, published by Hachette in September, was hands down the funniest adult fiction book I've read this year. Heartwarming and poignant too, I was thoroughly captivated by this modern tale of love, family and ageing. I'm thrilled to introduce Joanna Nell to the podcast. Hi, Joanna.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. Joanna, The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village is your first novel. Have you always wanted to be a writer?
I think I always have, probably without even realising it. It was something that as a child I just always loved to immerse myself in stories. I think I was sort of quite a quiet and bookish child that sort of retreated into those imaginary worlds. And I did get my first typewriter about the age of 8, and I sort of started typing up stories that were mainly, I think, inspired by the Silver Brumby books and Black Beauty. And I think, if anyone had ever suggested it at primary school that this might have been a career, it might have been something that I would have come to earlier in life. But it was almost as if, writers then were sort of born as sort of fully formed, Roald Dahls or Jane Austens or something. And it wasn't something that was ever suggested to me. And so I think at the back of my mind, I've always had this little idea, this dream, this fantasy. But it took me quite a long time in my life to ever fulfill this.
Brilliant. Well, you're not the first person I've heard that kind of comment from, so it's very interesting to hear it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. As a practicing GP, it's not hard to see where you might have drawn inspiration for this story, but were Peggy and her fellow retirees based on real-life characters?
Look, I certainly anticipate people are going to wonder about that. And no, they are entirely fictional. From an ethical point of view, I obviously can't, write about people I know or tell stories that I'm told in confidence. And as a GP, we're in incredibly privileged position because we do hear the most amazing sort of life stories and get these wonderful, intimate glimpses into people's lives every day. But I think I use those more as a sort of a little spark of inspiration. And the other reason I don't actually deliberately base the characters on anybody I know is that it could really potentially constrain the development of that character, because I like to just sort of start with them and see where they go, and they really sort of develop themselves over time rather than trying to base it on somebody in real life. So I'm waiting perhaps for somebody to come up to me and say, oh, I think you've written about, Betty Smith or whoever it is. But so far that hasn't happened. And although the retirement village is a fictional place, Jacaranda Retirement Village, I think through my sort of passion for care of the elderly, I did in my job spend a lot of my working week visiting retirement villages and, aged care facilities. And so, I was very familiar, and I've had several people who said, oh, this is very, very like the place that I live in. So I'm hoping that gave me a little bit of an insight into the real lives of retirement villages.
Oh, I'm sure it did. For listeners who haven't read it yet, can you tell me a little bit about your book?
Sure. So the novel takes place in the fictional setting of Jacaranda Retirement Village and tells the story really of quite a lonely widow called Peggy Smart. She's sort of staring down the barrel of her 80th birthday and is really sort of going through the motions a little bit of her life. She has reached that tipping point where she feels that her adult children are sort of starting to take over a bit and questioning her faculties and her abilities and starting to make decisions for her. And she's a little bit worried about losing her independence. And as I say, despite being surrounded by people, what she really longs for, I think, is that sort of intimate relationship, somebody close to her since she lost her husband. And really life takes an unexpected turn for Peggy when a woman she hasn't seen in decades, an old school friend of hers, who's led a very different life as a glamorous international jet-setting fashionista. Angie Valentine turns up in the same retirement village with a very different attitude to ageing, and sets Peggy off on what is a journey of self-discovery, and gives her a few lessons in ageing disgracefully.
I love that. um, Now, I know that you said that the retirement village and its surroundings, you were familiar with that from some of your work. But did you have to do any additional research for this novel?
Not terribly. Most of it, I think, was already in my head. I had to research a couple of strange things. I always worry as a writer if somebody ever goes to your Google history what they're going to make of you. But in my case, I had to look up the rules and regulations for what one of the scenes sets. It takes place in a committee meeting, and I wanted to look up, as I've never been a member of a committee, what a meeting involves, what the sort of the bylaws were, and I love how there are always people who stick really very closely to the rules, and so I wanted to look into that. And the other thing was that a couple of the scenes are set back in the late 1950s when Peggy and Angie work in the lingerie department of a department store in the city. And I wanted to really research what ladies' lingerie was like in 1959. So again, if somebody looks through my Google search history, they might wonder why I was doing that. But those were really the only bits of research I needed to do.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned before that it was set. This book is set in the Jacaranda retirement village, and it's fictional. But I understand that you've since learned that there actually is a retirement village by that name in New South Wales. Now, do they know about your book?
Yes. Look, I didn't know about that until afterwards. I mean, the sort of the name for Jacaranda Retirement Village sort of came about quite by accident. It was almost an ironic name because where I live in Sydney, I'm surrounded by these beautiful jacaranda trees. I counted the other day, they're all in blossom at the moment. There are 19 of them. And we have a very steep driveway, which for 6 weeks of the year is covered in this most beautiful purple blossom, but is a complete death trap. So it was a sort of slightly ironic name for the village. But I then was contacted after the book came out by somewhere called Jacaranda Village, which is in Victoria, and they were very excited about the book, and I did actually send them a signed copy for their library. I'd love to go and visit, but it's a little bit away from the main city, so I will have to make sure it's on my route at some stage.
Oh, that is just too funny. Now, you've addressed a number of themes in this book: aging, family, friendships, and grief, just to name some. It's a wonderful insight into the aging process and human nature. Were you at any stage worried about the appeal factor of a book with a 79-year-old protagonist?
Oh, absolutely. And when there was actually a long time when I thought, should I really write this book? And I think I've been destined to write it all my life. I was very close to my own grandparents, and as they really have found the lives of older people, completely fascinating, and I've had a deep respect. But there was, I suppose, a worry that nobody would really want to read this, and particularly as it does have sort of romantic elements to it, and also the fact that I don't shy away from some of the, shall we say, the physical indignities of ageing, and we do certainly, there's no doubt we live in quite an age and youth obsessed society, and I think up until now we've all been encouraged to fight the battle against ageing. Everything is anti-ageing. But what I started to see, what encouraged me to go ahead and write it and to ignore that little doubting voice, was that I think we're starting to see a change, and certainly the baby boomers and just beyond are retiring and ageing in a different way completely to previous generations. And I think we're seeing a lot in social media and in the press about positive ageing, and we have some fantastic role models now. And so it was really a case of thinking, why not? Why shouldn't we have more stories where the protagonists are in their 70s, 80s, 90s? That their stories, if anything, are the richest, and the most interesting of anybody. And if we're going to have a romantic heroine, does she really have to be, 20 or 30? Why can't, age is certainly no barrier to falling in love. And so there was a little bit of rebellion, I think, involved in actually making that decision to do it. But I was, completely blown away with the reception that it had, amongst the sort of publishers, and certainly with the feedback I've had from readers too. So, I was really thrilled.
That's brilliant, brilliant, Joanna. Now we were talking. We obviously know that Peggy lives in a retirement village, and as you touched on before, she's fiercely guarding her independence, but fears it will be taken away from her at any moment. That she might succumb to dementia or Alzheimer's or worse, a stroke, and be carted away to a nursing home by her adult children. Now, is this something that you've seen play out often in your work as a doctor?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this was also one of the motivations for writing this. I've sort of been in the middle of many a discussion between two parties. One is the individual themselves who is aging and perhaps, most commonly starting to notice that their memory, or that other people have noticed that their memory isn't what it should be, perhaps having falls, or, finding life a little bit difficult. And then, of course, very loving and well-meaning, usually adult children that are there and concerned about, the safety of their parent. And I often find there's this sort of battle between one person wanting their independence and being able to make decisions for themselves, and that other side of the equation where, that it comes from a place of, well-meaning, but certainly is a little bit stifling. And so it was really my thought about exploring what it was like to be that person who was starting to lose that sort of freedom and, if you like, or independence, and have the tables turn on them. And I was hoping that by writing the book from the point of view of a woman sort of facing her 80th birthday, that I might give readers of all age, or certainly older readers, someone that they could identify with, that they could relate to, but also perhaps younger people an insight, if you like, give a little bit of empathy and compassion. It was definitely something that was one of the main sort of motivating factors behind the book.
Absolutely, and I think you've done that really brilliantly. I think you've given a very balanced perspective
Thank you.
on that particular issue. Now, I was going to say I cry quite easily when reading books, but few books make me laugh out loud like a loon. I was reading yours. I mean, truly, I was reading yours on a domestic flight recently, and I found myself elbowing my husband constantly and pointing out some of Peggy's malapropisms, and as I held my belly laughing. And my favourite was when Peggy was in the car with Brian talking about kitchen germs. I'll just leave it at that.
That's a favourite one, I think, yes.
Absolutely. And Peggy's response is Brian swerving to avoid a cyclist. And I could not contain myself. I think everybody must have been looking at me thinking that this woman's off her head. And in terms of creating a memorable character, you've really managed to do that in spades with Peggy. Now, did you do that deliberately? Like, give her these like quirky, characteristics and funny, speech?
It was never something that sort of started out as a conscious characteristic. Certainly, she drew a little bit on my grandmother's, one of whom was sort of slightly hilarious with how she did sort of mix up her words, and another one who could never remember anybody's name, and we sort of went through a roll call of grandchildren's names, and you just had to put your hand up when you got to the right one. But Peggy's malapropisms, they really came in quite a later draft, and I think I really needed to get to know her. And I think the more that I got to know her, the more she revealed these little quirks, if you like. And yes, I think it was, almost one of the final drafts where she suddenly just let rip with all these, with all these sort of ridiculous takes on words. And it was so much fun to write. I had so much fun writing Peggy and sort of trying to, keep a straight face at what she was saying. But no, it is something that's actually that struck a chord with a lot of readers. They found them quite funny. And I think you've got to be a little bit careful with humour. It wasn't something actually that I set out to write, because I think if you're trying to make something funny, it can occasionally feel a bit contrived. But it just happened to be the voice that I suppose, developed as a writer over time, and the characters and their situations. And I tend to use humour quite a bit in my work as well. And sometimes it's quite good to break the ice, or, to build up a bit of a rapport, or to, give a bit of light and shade when things are serious or difficult or dark. And so it's just something that's evolved. But certainly the kitchen worktop, it's brought a whole new meaning to, how clean is your kitchen?
Oh, I absolutely loved it. And I loved Peggy. I thought she was just brilliant.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
Now, you've won quite a few awards for your short story writing. Did you find the leap between short form fiction and the novel difficult, or was the novel a natural progression from your short story writing?
Uh, it was a natural progression. I think I started off with short stories, and I sort of fell in love with that genre, really. And I think by the time I'd sort of understood the conventions of that, and it had helped me to sort of hone my writing skills. And I naively assumed that writing a novel was just like writing a really long short story, and it's completely different genre. So it took a while, I think, to again learn, the structure of that. But I think there were some lessons that I did take away from writing short stories, and that was about, leaving a lot to the reader as well. You don't have to explain everything, keeping it quite sort of short and punchy, and making every word count, if you like. So the other thing is working to a deadline, or, a word count. So I think there were some really useful skills that I took away from writing short stories. So yes, look, it's a completely different genre. I mean, but look, I've enjoyed both, and although I've been working on novels recently, I still occasionally have ideas for a short story and think, I'd just love to sit down and write a whole collection one day, but we'll see.
Fascinating. Now, I'm always interested to learn about authors like you who've had other careers before moving to writing. What is it about writing that has made you strive to become a published novelist?
Um, I don't think when I started writing, I ever really envisaged that I would be published, and that wasn't the motivation for writing, because the odds against it are, heavily stacked. It's very. I realise I've been extremely lucky to have had a success finding an agent and a publisher. But for me, it was writing for the pure joy of it. It was something that felt so natural to me, and anybody who does write will know that feeling of just being lost completely in time. And so, look, the publishing, if I'd never been published, I would still be writing. It was that it's going back for that hit of dopamine, when something has gone right, when a sentence has come out beautifully, or you've tackled a problem, or you feel like you've just had that flow for a period of time. That gives the brain a real hit of dopamine, and that's a really addictive thing. You want to keep going back for more and more and more. And so I think even without the publishing, I would still be writing. But I've been extremely lucky. I'm still pinching myself. It's been, I keep waiting to wake up from the dream. It's been incredible.
Well, no,
Yeah.
it's definitely deserved success, Joanna.
Oh, thanks.
Now, do you think you'll continue to practice as a doctor?
Yes, I did toy with sort of giving up completely, but I realised that it's such an important part of me, and I've enjoyed my career, and I've done it for so long now. I've been a doctor for nearly 30 years, um, and so it's something that I want to continue doing. I'm very lucky to now have this opportunity to, if I wanted to be a full-time writer. But what I'd like to do is to try and combine the two and try and find a really nice balance. They do obviously involve a lot of the same skills, but different sides of the brain. And I think I've found that, although I have taken a few months off practice and I've just gone back now, I wasn't necessarily very much more productive with all day, every day to write, as I was when I did it in little sort of, binges, if you like, and in opportunistically, when I got the a bit of spare time and sort of really looked forward to it and did a lot of thinking and mental preparation, and then went and wrote. So I don't find it necessarily although it had always been my dream to, sort of be a full-time writer, I don't actually find it necessarily very much easier being a full-time writer. Isn't that funny? It's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Now, you've worked in some really interesting places over the years as a doctor, and one of those has inspired another novel. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I presume you're talking about the ship. Yes, I've had a bit of an eclectic medical career before I sort of settled down in general practice. And one of the jobs I did was I was a ship's doctor on a cruise ship for a couple of years, which is where I met my husband. He was an engineer officer. And in fact, our son now is joining the Merchant Navy. So I feel like we have the sort of the sea in our blood, if you like.
Yeah.
And there were so many wonderful stories and adventures that I had at sea. It was really an incredible time of my life. And I'd always wanted to write something about it, but it didn't feel quite right to write a memoir about it. I wanted to have a little bit more license to explore it. And so the next book is set on a cruise ship, but it's told from the point of view of an older lady, a very grand lady, who has lived her life aboard a cruise ship. And one day her husband goes missing. So that's all I'll say about it at the moment. And the title of that is The Last Voyage of Mrs. Henry Parker. So that's due out next year. And I've had so much fun writing that one. I've just loved writing that book.
Excellent. And so is that the only thing that you're working on, or are you working on a third?
I'm playing about with some ideas at the moment, so I do have an idea for a third novel. It's hard, I think, once the sort of creative beast has been unleashed, there's sort of so many ideas, that are all around, really, and it's just trying to pin them down and work out really what's going to be something that I can turn into another book. But look, I would love it. Would be my dream to keep writing novels, and so as long as I can use that time and find the inspiration, that's really such an important part of my life now.
Indeed. Now, Joanna, if listeners wanted to connect with you or to learn more about your book or forthcoming books, where can they find you?
So I do have a website, which is www.joannanell.com, and there's a little bit about me on there. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and you're going to ask me what my handles are there. So I think it might be under Jo Nell Writer on those, but I'm sure that you'll find me on there.
Brilliant. On that note, Joanna, I wanted to congratulate you once more on a wonderful debut in the Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village. I can't thank you enough for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Claudine. It's been lovely, and all the best to your listeners.
Thank you. Now, listeners, for your chance to win a signed copy of Joanna's heartwarming book, head on over to my Facebook or Instagram feeds. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.